is Hatim Kheir. I hope I said that right, Hatim, from
Yeah,
the
you got
Justice
it.
Center for Okay, perfect. From the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I'm a big fan. I sat behind you for 2 days. I never actually got a chance to talk to you, but I'm a fan of some of your other work on freedom causes here in Alberta. And you are doing what I would describe as a bit of the Lord's work there, because these tow truck drivers who were compelled against their will to be tools of the state, that really irks me. I just despise it. I loathe so much the idea of the state commandeering anybody's personal property and their business, but especially when it violates their conscience. And as we know, out here in Alberta, they couldn't get a tow truck or energy company to come help them within, I think, the entire northwestern part of the continent. And so the Alberta government had to buy their own towing equipment, which they never really had to ultimately use. But you were really hammering the government today on the use of the Emergencies Act to force tow truck operators to violate their conscience. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And I know we've got a couple of clips that we'll go to after.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many, rights violations and freedom issues surrounding this whole thing, but one of the ones that are probably most centrally affected are the tow truck drivers. They were forced to physically do something and assist with perhaps something that they didn't want to do. Well, I mean, if they had to be forced, they didn't want to do it. But then specifically why, certainly some of them supported the Freedom Convoy protest. Minister Alghabra admitted as much. So the government had to use emergency powers in order to compel them to do that. So the purpose of my cross-examination was to put that to Minister Alghabra, though when asked, he resisted the question. Let's say he kind of resorted to the idea that, well, I don't know how the police used the power. Hopefully they used it on people who wanted to help anyways. If that's the case, you don't need a power to make them do it.
Right. That was the part that I thought was kind of ridiculous. Was he said, I don't really know how the selection process works, but I sort of kind of hope they selected the ones that wanted to do it. Well, then why did you invoke the act to compel tow truck drivers if you just knew that there were ones that wanted to do it? He just sort of painted himself into this circular logic. And also, if you don't know how police are going to use that power appropriately, maybe you shouldn't be giving it to them.
That's exactly right. And we saw a similar dynamic with the use of the economic measures to freeze bank accounts, where the Finance Canada creates the power, or at least is responsible for the discussions that led to its creation. Then the power gets handed out to the police. And then when they get pressed on the decision that they made to create the powers in the first place, they say, hey, we weren't responsible for how it was used. We hope that they just used it responsibly and that they didn't use the powers that we gave them if it was going to result in rights violations.
Yeah. We hope they didn't use the power to do whatever they want, to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah. So in the example of the Finance Canada, we gave them the power to freeze donors' bank accounts, but we hope that they didn't do it. Why? Why did you do that then?
Yeah, exactly. Let's, Olivia in studio, we've got, I think, 2 clips of you pressing on some of my favorite people on the planet, tow truck drivers. Let's go to the first one.
I'm just gonna push back on that one answer you gave me, because I asked you if tow truck drivers who would have refused out of sympathy with the protest, as you highlighted in your interview statement, would have been compelled by the emergency measure regulations to serve a cause that they did not agree with, and you responded by talking about the necessity of it. But I'm asking you, were those people compelled to serve a cause that they felt went against their conscience and their choice of association?
So I answered the question by saying I was not involved in how tow truck drivers or tow truck companies were selected. I would like to think that there were options to select tow truck drivers who were willing to participate.
You'd like to think that, but certainly the power created that opportunity, right?
I was not involved in the selection of tow truck drivers.
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
What on earth is he talking about there? I hope that they would select the ones that wanted to do it, but the point is that you couldn't find ones that wanted to do it.
Which also we've seen from other evidence isn't the case. There were tow truck drivers lined up either in Coutts or on the other side of the continent in Windsor and in Ottawa before the Emergencies Act was invoked. And we heard that from witnesses from the Ottawa Police Service, from the OPP, and from Minister DeGrand from Alberta.
Yeah, we did hear that. I think there was some 30 tow trucks with, I think, 7 or 9 that were heavy haul tow trucks with the capabilities to pull some of these larger trucks and tractor trailers out of location. They had those lined up and ready to go. And I think the OPP testified to that. And I think the OPS also testified to that. And so I don't know how much prep these ministers do before they get here. I would like to think that with an army of government lawyers, they would have been a little bit more prepared. And I don't know if they just think that they can rewrite history in real time, but it is true that there were tow trucks lined up, ready to go. They did not need the Emergencies Act for tow trucks in the nation's capital, and they definitely didn't need them in Alberta because Alberta circumvented the whole process, realizing on and around the 10th that they weren't going to get any help whatsoever from the federal government with regard to getting Canadian Forces equipment out of the base in Edmonton, which I have been informed by several people, both past and present CAF members. There's a lot of that equipment just sitting there, even though we heard testimony that there was just none to spare.
Yeah, and so we one of the big things we learned today was actually that the provinces, other than Alberta, were offered assistance by the federal government to buy their own tow trucks if they wanted to do that, and they refused. In Windsor, the police turned back tow trucks from coming from the United States because they didn't need it. Superintendent Bernier testified that he was able to look out the window and see tow trucks, and that he was satisfied that they were good. So, although this may have been a concern at one point, it was resolved before the declaration of emergency, and that's kind of a running theme that we've been seeing in the evidence. If you look at Windsor, Windsor was cleared right before the Emergency Act was invoked. In Ottawa, they prepared a plan that was just about ready to go right as the Emergency Act was invoked. And in Coutts, the police operation that led to arrests, which then convinced the other protesters to leave, happened right before the Emergency Act was invoked. And yesterday we learned that at the First Minister's meeting, that was being relayed to the federal government. They're required to consult with the premiers of the provinces before a declaration of emergency, presumably for such a purpose, so that they can get information about whether it's actually necessary. And across the board, multiple premiers said our local law enforcement has got it. The situation is under control. We're getting the tow trucks we need, but the federal government went ahead and invoked the Emergencies Act anyways.
You also pushed back on Omar Alghabra or Alghabra, I'm not sure how to say it. He said that he was unaware, I think to you, he said he was unaware of the reluctance of tow truck operators to help the convoy, yet were compelled to assist in removing of the blockades. And then he was questioned on whether or not this would violate their charter rights. And we saw the second half of that, but he sort of, the first half of him, like, not answering the question, I think is really important, because you ask him, did you take any steps, or were these people even a consideration in all of this? And I think his lack of answer really speaks to the fact that he didn't even see these tow truck operators as individual Canadians with individual rights and individual wills. They were not tools of the state, never once, even though he used a law to make them that way. Why don't we throw to that one, Efron, and Olivia, if you can find it.
And its intention was to protect the charter rights of Canadians? That's our Constitution, and we're all sworn to uphold our Constitution. Do you believe Cabinet protected the charter rights of tow truck drivers? We kept in mind the charter rights of all Canadians, including truck drivers. You'd agree that tow truck drivers weren't protesters themselves, aside from perhaps individual cases? I don't understand the question. Well, so you said in your interview summary that some tow truck drivers refused to tow trucks out of sympathy with the protest, right? I said that
yes, there was a reluctance for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons may be because they might be sympathetic, but the bigger reasons that we heard is that they were afraid for their livelihood and their safety.
Okay, so even if they were afraid, why did you make them do it?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of reasons tow truck drivers may have refused to do something, but presumably that's a choice that they can make. And our charter protects the right to freedom of association, which one would hope would include the right to choose who you work for and what work you want to undertake.
Yeah, your questions it was like a big bear snare that he just sat there and he just put his leg right in it, didn't he? Yes, we care about charter rights. Look at us. We're good guys. And then, oh yeah, what about the tow truck drivers? And he had no idea what to say. There was like 3 solid seconds of awkward silence there. And I'm so glad you didn't say anything, because the silence says more than the words ever could. We've got one more clip from you. Omar Alghabra thanked the truckers during the Public Order Commission. He stated that the policies developed over the pandemic were cohesive with the guidance received from public health and from observing the situation on the ground. Efron, I tagged you in that. Would you mind if you can find that? He needs 5 seconds. Let's see what else. What else did Omar Alghabra do today? He also said he's not making any apology for doing what he believed to be the best thing for protecting lives. He said our policies were based on the advice and facts and the science that we received, not based on polls or number of protesters. But we know that's not true because they invoked the Emergencies Act they revoked the Emergencies Act because they knew they were going to lose in the Senate and they were going to lose the favor of the NDP. So it's interesting to see text messages saying, oh, I think the NDP are going to vote against us. We have to quit invoking the Emergencies Act. And then Alghabra testifying that policies were completely based on following the science and their advice. Did you find that clip, Efron?
Well, given the motivation of the protesters, did the government consider resuming the exemption for truckers?
We don't make public policy based on the number of protesters or emails that we get. We make public policy, particularly during the pandemic. And let me be the first to acknowledge, governments around the world, including the federal government, did extraordinary measures in what we believed was the right thing to protect the health and safety of Canadians. I never imagined provinces shutting down businesses. I never imagined provinces invoking curfews. I never imagined the federal government putting limitation on travel. But we all did that. Governments across Canada did these measures because we believed we are saving lives. And yes, they were extraordinary, but I could tell you, no one, at least us, I'm not making any apology for doing what we believed the best thing for protecting lives. Now, of course, it caused inconvenience. Of course, it caused disruption. And our government did whatever we can to mitigate those disruptions. And Canadians understood that. So back to your question, our policies were based on the advice and facts and the science that we receive, not based on polls or number of protesters or even the illegal activities that should never drive public policy.
So you get different science than the other places in the world. Did you have an opportunity to travel outside of the country recently, or at least when the mask mandates were still on just Canadian Airlines? I went to Geneva with Sarah Miller and I came back like in 18 hours. But I knew exactly where my gate was in the Geneva airport because those were the only people wearing masks to get onto a Canadian airplane. And that was because of Omar Alghabra. And he says he follows the science, but the science seems to change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I mean, only Quebec had a curfew. I'd like to know how many lives that saved. I want to know how many lives masks on airplanes saved. It feels like he was just making it up as he went along to see what he could get away with for as long as he could.
Yeah, so that his answer there was part of a line of questions I was asking him about the actions of other provinces in lifting their restrictions. Now, there's a pattern where we've seen at least 4 provinces that took dramatic moves during the protest. And like, for example, we see in Ontario, Premier Ford didn't want to say
Alberta.
that was they don't want to say that that's in response to the protests. But we also saw a summary of a phone call by Premier Ford yesterday where he was saying the public is at a breaking point. I think it's obvious that the premiers were responding to the protests. And so then the question is, why couldn't the federal government do the same, especially if if provinces are going to start allowing a stadium of up to like 500 people to operate? We can't let truckers who sit alone in their cabs can cross the border without a vaccine. And at the end of the day, Minister Alghabra didn't want to acknowledge that the provinces were responding to the protests, and he maintained that they wouldn't listen to the protesters. It's based on the science. And he even there was a comment he said, I think it was shortly after that clip that you played, but he said that sometimes the sentiments of Canadians and their interests are different, which I think basically just amounts to saying we know better than they do.
Exactly. That's exactly how I would interpret that. And it is true that the provinces were reacting. In Alberta, once they started blockading Coots, we went from we're going to drop the vaccine passport at the end of the month to 2 weeks from now to the end of the week to tonight at midnight. like in the course of one day, that's how quickly it moved up. As the convoy rolled through Saskatchewan, Scott Moe was like, don't convoy me, bro. We're done with the vaccine mandate here too. It was happening that fast. And ultimately, whether or not you think the science is different or unreliable or whatever, these are Canadians telling you, I'm willing to accept the risk. And isn't that what it comes down to, is Canadians who are saying, look, you've told me everything I need to know about COVID. You won't shut up about COVID. But I'm over it and I'm willing to accept the risk. It's like the same thing why people still smoke, even though you put the scary face on the cigarette package. People were deciding, I'm willing to accept whatever risk here to go about living my lives again. And certain provinces were making those concessions. And Omar Alghabra, just as you say, thought he knew better.
Yeah, and this is kind of an issue that's been floating in the background of this whole inquiry, because the commission is tasked with investigating the circumstances that led to the declaration of emergency. So there's obviously, and rightly so, been a lot of focus on the protest and the way police handled it and the way the government responded to it and what they knew. But behind all that is the reason the protest happened in the first place. And so Antoine Dailly for Citizens for Freedom took Minister Mendicino to that the other day, and I tried to take Minister Alghabra there now, because it's an important part of the story that happened here. That this protest happened 2 years after 2 years of lockdowns, 2 years of vaccine mandates. And actually, we did hear, so before all the witnesses today, there was a summary of all the evidence that the commission had received from the public about what they had to say about their experience with the protest. And it was very divided. It was there was 2 complete opposite sides. But one of those sides was saying that it was a relief to have this protest because we had felt alienated, we had felt isolated, and suddenly there were people standing side by side, singing the Canadian anthem, waving flags. And that's an important part of understanding why all this happened in the first place.
That's a great way to leave this interview with you. We're going to go to an ad so that we can let you leave a little bit more gracefully than you would if we didn't. Hatim, thanks so much for the great work that you're doing in there. I know we at Rebel News pay very close attention to the work that you're doing for the Justice Centre and for the rights and freedoms of Canadians. So thanks for working so hard.
Thanks for having me on.